I'm talking to Elayne Archer, who is the author of Crossing Troubled Waters, Memoirs of an English War Widow. It's quite a saga. Would you like to describe your book, or how would you describe it? Obviously,
Well,
memoirs.
it's basic. It's a memoir. My mother wrote 100 and when she died, my brother and I inherited 140 typewritten pages, which equals 200 pages,
Wow.
describing my mother's life. With a lot of, one of the reasons I really thought I had to do something with it, it took me many years, is because it's a wonderful interplay of history and personal history. I mean, my mother describes not only the war and the Blitz and how that, my father's death and how that changed our lives totally, but it also her description of it being a working woman in 1930s London, and then as a working mother in Toronto, where she faced almost hostility. Women didn't work, mothers did not work in those days. And my mother, and there was no childcare. So I just thought it was an interesting description of what women have gone through. And only recently has it improved a bit, trying to deal with working and having children, whatever. When I first did it, I only did what my mother wrote, and I wrote, a few explanations for English terms. And then when my brother died, I inherited several boxes of further materials, letters from the RAF, my mother's other letters, more journal entries and postcards and photographs. And I thought this would be a much better memoir if I included all of those. And then I realized I sort of had to include my experience. I wrote it originally for my children. They were my audience. My children, just my son and my daughter, and who knew much less about their English family than they did about their father's family, my husband and my ex-husband's family, because they lived much closer to them. And I thought, this is the story of their English family, and my mother was really an amazing woman. There was the time when I realized I had to expand it. I had a draft of it in 2015. And then I discovered all those papers I told you about, and that took me another 3 years, partially because with all of that, I found a whole package of, my mother didn't throw out anything. Every letter I'd ever written my mother from Radcliffe.
Wow.
89 letters written on yellow, what I call foolscap, yellow legal pads, right, back and front. And I took what I thought would be 2 months. It turned out to be 6 months, reading all the letters at least twice, summarizing them. First, I asked the Radcliffe, the Schlesinger, if they'd like them. And of course they'd like them because they don't get letters anymore, right? Nobody writes letters. And then I wrote a 20-page essay on those times, both what I was going through and, what was happening in the world, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the blackout of 1965, the call up to Vietnam. And that took me about 6 months. So I took that time off, and then I got back. Those were the roadblocks. I didn't have writer's block so much as I had to just keep at it, which is what I did. I had my mother's example. And then I suppose one of my favorite passages, although I'd read it just once before, was my father's letters from Malta, in which he wrote one, say, on the 22nd of April, a few weeks before he died, congratulating my mother on having given birth to me on his very birthday. So I didn't know actually until I saw that letter that he knew I'd ever been born. So that was nice to know. I lived in Toronto until I came to Radcliffe, and I lived in Toronto for 18 years, although I'm not a Canadian citizen. I never had to become a citizen. I was a landed immigrant from what was then the British Empire, I guess. And the reason I applied to Radcliffe was that my brother was going back to drama school in London, and my mother was saying she was going to go back to London too. I didn't want to be the only one left in Toronto, so I applied to Radcliffe. And amazingly enough, what I found out, this is another story, but I found out on the day, 2 days before graduation, I met the lovely woman at a cocktail party who had interviewed me, and she said, Oh, I remember you. The committee was so impressed that you came all the way from the north. I think she figured Toronto was in the North Pole. And in the midst of winter, we admitted you immediately. We were so eager to fill our foreign student quota. So, I've always been a defender of quotas because I got into Radcliffe on a quota. But, Radcliffe did change my life because if I hadn't gone, I probably would have gone to the University of Toronto and still be living in Canada.
Yeah.
At one point, my mother announced that there would be some money coming. It was a week before Christmas, 2 weeks, from the Institute of Journalists. My father had been a member of that, and they would send us money occasionally. And I really did have visions of a wonderful roast beef and plum pudding dinner. And then my mother announced, I still remember, as I wrote this, I thought a lot about memory. How do you remember things? Do you add to it? I remember this when she announced that she'd use the money to buy tickets to see Tamburlaine the Great at the Royal Alexandra Theatre. And I remember thinking and saying to my brother, Tamburlaine the Great, I mean, Hamlet, come on, Macbeth. Anyway, I remember going into the theater, and it was one of those, it was a lot of gold and cherubs and chandeliers and red velvet seats, but we went up to the very top. But I did think, wow, the theater. We were in the last row, almost perpendicular to the stage. And when the chariot comes on with Tamburlaine, I thought, wow, the theater is really different. I looked at my mother, there was a tear coming down her face. And I look back now, I realize she was probably thinking of my father when they went to the theater in London. At the very end, and this is what I really remember, and I did not make this up or elaborate it, my mother stood up and shouted, and I clapped and shouted, bravo, bravo. But nobody in Toronto ever said such a thing. That was unheard of. They all looked at her, but the main actor, a man called Anthony Quayle, who later became knighted, it was apparently a very famous production of Tamburlaine. He stepped forward, he bowed to her and took off his crown. My mother was so happy, and I just think it was proof of, forget a roast beef dinner. We're going to the theater. And it was an important lesson for me that, reading books and going to plays going to museums. I remember the letters I wrote my mother from Radcliffe are full of all the museums I went to and all the plays I'd seen. And she really must have thought my daughter is becoming an educated, truly educated person. And that is what Harvard did for me. Yes, I think.